So I'm joined today by Max Krieger, and we're going to be talking about CrossNIQ, which is his puzzle game. Thanks for taking some time to talk with us, Max.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, for people that haven't run into CrossNIQ, why don't we start off by you giving us the pitch, so to speak, of this game?
Sure thing. So, CrossNIQ is a speed-oriented, score-based puzzle game with a Y2K flavor that's really like a cross between a Rubik's Cube and Bejeweled or a Match 3 game sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that Y2K flavor, because when I first started playing this, which I should, before we get going further, if any of this sounds interesting to anybody watching this, you can go to the itch page for CrossNIQ and you can play an early version of it right now. So there will be a link in the details below, so you can go check that out, and we encourage you to do so. I'll start by asking where the flavor of this game kind of came from. When I first started playing it, I kind of thought DDR, which is kind of fits perfectly in with that Y2K flavor. I remember, right around the late 90s, early 2000s, this was kind of style was all the rage in a lot of video games. So where did that come from, and why did you decide to go that route?
Well, it's really interesting. I was into vaporwave a lot in college. That was really, really popular, like the mid-2010s. And I really, really loved that all of these weird, crazy visual design aesthetics from the 1990s and 1980s were being resurrected, because that was kind of from before a time where we relied on things like algorithms and A/B testing and thorough internet-based market research to determine, taste and advertising and industrial design, things like that. You did market research, of course, but at the end of the day, somebody had an idea of what looked trendy, and you just went with it. And so it kind of resulted in all these really outlandish visual styles. And by the time I graduated college in 2015, Vaporwave was starting to wind down. A lot of the good artists had moved on to other projects, and the blogs were starting to become more and more recycled content, and I wanted something new. So I happened to stumble across, in 2016, a blog called the Y2K Aesthetic Institute, and that's on Tumblr. And I just had this huge brain rush, because all of a sudden, this look, which was really popular, like you mentioned, in like 1997 to 2000 days, it all came rushing back to me, because I realized, holy shit, this was the future when I was a kid. This was the vision of the future that was all around me. This kind of cool colors, a lot of chrome, kind of bioorganic forms, and like these weird concepts for crazy biotechnology, and a lot of 90s rave gear and things like that. And so I was totally all about it. And I had this idea for a puzzle game that had been lying around. It kind of had just been in cold storage when I had been working on my previous project, Train. And I took it out, and I was like, okay, what do I want to do with this? And I saw this Y2K stuff, and I also remembered that Y2K visual aesthetic was really prominent in video games. Like you mentioned, Dance Dance Revolution, is all the Bimani stuff, as it's called. Huge, huge, huge Y2K flavor there. And games like Jet Set Radio, Channel 5, and all of that. But I was really reminded of, the late 90s were also like the golden era for Japanese arcade puzzle games. We had games like Puzzle Fighter, Magical Drop 3, Tetris the Grandmaster were all coming around that time. And I just seemed like a natural marriage to me, so I just went for it.
Cool. So then why, I guess, the next question I had is why the cross? And not necessarily the cross per se, but kind of, was this your first iteration of how this puzzle was going to work? Did you always have this idea that it was going to be all about making crosses, all about making these T-shapes? Or was this something that kind of developed a little bit later on?
Now, believe it or not, and this isn't very common for me, the idea for making the crosses did kind of come part and parcel as one, solid concept back when I first conceived this. And I like to consider it like my brain telling me, Max, you have been working on Train, which was my previous project, which was this big narrative kind of artsy indie game with a bunch of different game mechanics and a lot of dialogue, and it was this huge big thing that ended up taking about 2.5 years to finish. And at the tail end of train, my brain was like, Max, you have been working on this big angled game for like 2.5 years. Here is a nice, simple set of game mechanics. Now, what I want you to do is refine them and make them nice. Now, don't overwork yourself this time and be kind to yourself. So it kind of just emerged like that. I think probably the biggest influence on it was I was playing a lot of Tetris the Grandmaster at the time. And for those of you not familiar, it's this super, super, super hardcore version of Tetris developed by this Japanese developer called Arika. And it's kind of become really popular again because of Awesome Games Done Quick.
Yeah.
It's a real showstopper. So I'd been playing a lot of TGM, and I was like, wow, this is great. I really love how kind of like fast-paced this is. And it also felt a little bit like DDR-ish in its aesthetic. It had a lot of the same composers that worked on DDR games. And so I was like, I want to do something cool like this. But, I mean, Tetris is about making rows. And then I thought, what if I made a row and a column? And being a cross. So,
did this present any sort of surprising hurdles in design? I mean, you've got a bunch of different special blocks, which once you kind of get in and play the tutorial, you learn about these blocks that don't move or only move a certain way or add bonuses. And as I was first kind of interacting with those, I couldn't help but feel like maybe there might have been some other kind of special blocks that didn't make the cut that, kind of proved a little bit too problematic in design. And I was wondering if there were any kind of things like that you wanted to share.
Oh yeah, there were a few of those that definitely got cut in development. I introduced a prototype of CrossNIQ that was essentially just moving and making crosses. And it was just, it was all this programmer art and didn't look pretty. And I just introduced it to a local game developers group that I go to here in Cleveland, Ohio. And I was like, here's the base game. How do I spice this up? And I just took open suggestions for all sorts of different pieces I could have. And people had crazy ideas like pieces that turn adjacent pieces into the same color, pieces that like reverse controls, and there were just all these crazy ideas. And I prototyped a bunch of them. And ultimately, the ones that made the cut were the ones that actually made the most sense in a game and felt challenging while not being overly chaotic. And when you have a simple concept like this, because when you strip away all the window dressing and all of the additional tiles, CrossNIQ's super, super simple. So you have a thing like this, iteration is really the key, at least for me. And I really wanted to do an iterative project where it was a back and forth with people who were interested. That was a goal of CrossNIQ from the beginning. And so, yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff that got cut. And hopefully some of it I will be able to revisit in CrossNIQ Plus now that I actually have a feel for how the game flows and what feels right and what doesn't.
Awesome. So yeah, speaking about the iterative process, we would encourage people, if this at all sounds interesting, right up your alley. As a fan of puzzle games, I can say that this is right in the perfect niche of kind of a fast-paced puzzle. It's very fast-paced, which kind of surprised me a little bit when I started playing around with it. Check it out. Links below. I'd like to kind of move on to find out what your story is as an indie dev and what drew you to the world of making games independently.
Oh, cool. Well, I've been a Cleveland native for 25 years, and that's with a brief hiatus where I went to college in Chicago. I went to DePaul University, and DePaul was a very interesting place because the Midwest is not exactly known for being an indie hub. If there's any city in the Midwest that would be Chicago.
Yeah.
DePaul is a school that put out games such as Octodad, which was really famous. The guy that made a game called Oregon Trail was also a big deal back in the day. There's my friend Chris Wade, who's an indie, who's putting out his game Sausage Sports Club on the Nintendo Switch this year. A ton of excellent indie talent was really centered around DePaul. And there are also studios in Chicago, like NetherRealm, obviously, here's the new Mortal Kombat games, Wargaming West, things like that. They all really congregated in Chicago. And so I was exposed to all of these indies, past and present, and I really thought to myself, what if I don't just go for a AAA job right out of college? Because I was in the video game development program, which it was great because third of our faculty were all ex-Midway. So these were like the guys that were like defining so many arcade classics.
Right.
It was really sweet. I heard some crazy stories. But yeah, so I was really exposed to all that, and I was like, what if I go indie rather than, go right into AAA out of school? It would save me a bit of money, first of all. I've taking a more traditional developer route as my day job allowed me to save up the money that I would need for something like CrossNIQ Plus, which is
Sure.
the Kickstarter. And but no, that really put the confidence in me that if they can do it, I can do it too. And it was really those people who I was around during my education. But it didn't stop there, because here in Cleveland, we have an excellent developer community, really supportive, and from people from all walks of life, which I really like about Cleveland. We have people here who, worked on big AAA or mid-core titles, who have come back to Cleveland and really kind of just hang out and mentor people. We have students from, places like Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Institute of Art, where the game development program is absolutely booming right now. And then we just have hobbyists who they may not even be interested in making a commercial product. They just want to make something really cool. And so really being exposed to that and continuing to being exposed to that, even in a place like Cleveland, really gave me the motivation to, go for CrossNIQ and make it as big as it could be.
That's awesome. That's a great snapshot of the indie community in that part of the country. That's great. So what were some of your inspirations? Not necessarily just for CrossNIQ, but kind of those games that stick out in your mind that you played that and that's what got you interested in making games.
My my childhood was a really interesting mix of being glued to the TV, watching a crap ton of anime when I was little, and that, and I, as the nerd story often goes, being a nerd in middle school wasn't easy, and so when I didn't have things to go to or had friends to hang out with, I just really started collecting a bunch of games. Now, what I don't tell a lot of people, and this is kind of an embarrassing fact about me because I'm huge into retro games, my very first console, my first handheld was a Game Boy, but my very first home console was a Nintendo GameCube. I didn't grow up with like SNES or N64. I was so smitten that I went back and collected them all on my own. And
That's great.
I had a lot of catching up to do, but when I did that, I just kind of dived into this world of video games that not a lot of people were really into at the time, and that includes a lot of titles from the late 90s and early 2000s that were big inspirations. And they kind of meshed with how anime was a big part of my life growing up and created this image of what was cool. And I was just like this, starry-eyed little kid, like gobbling up like JRPGs and watching Gundam Wing and Tsunami. And that was really what was cool to me when the world around me wasn't exactly as welcoming to a nerd as it could have been. Now, as I grew up, video games obviously got a lot more popular.
Sure.
And, AAA titles, things like Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed, etc., started to really draw a lot more people into video games. And I still never really lost the soft spot for the stuff that I grew up with. Not just because it was nostalgic, because that's a reason for a lot of people, but because it really had a unique look and feel like no other media I had ever encountered. And I felt like since I was so inspired by that, if I would be able to take that inspiration and synthesize something entirely new, that I would be able to create games that were unique and stood out, even if they weren't exactly traditional. And, I mean, CrossNIQ isn't exactly traditional. Not everybody's been a fan. And it's been hard to really shake the stigma of a puzzle game in 2018. People see puzzle game and they assume, oh, this is the thing I'm going to, throw on my smartphone, and it's going to throw a bunch of ads at me, and it's going to be something that I play in my spare time. And I really want to get out there and remind people that puzzle games are more than that.
Oh, absolutely.
Look at Puyo Puyo Tetris.
Yeah.
A couple years ago, nobody would have talked about Puyo Puyo if you entered a room of, like at a convention or something like that. Now everybody's playing Puyo, everybody's playing Tetris, and I really want to ride that wave. But that spirit and that unique element of design and the soul of the whole thing really stuck with me ever since I was a kid, and that's been a big driving force for me ever since.
Fantastic. So final kind of question for you to bring this to a close. Every time we ever talk to an indie dev, we always ask what other indie projects have captured their eye. Kind of keep the chain going. Use that as a jumping off point to the next person to talk to. So what other indie games or indie dev teams are really doing something that kind of inspires you personally?
Well, first off, I got to give a shout out to one of my favorite Cleveland developers, Jared Huntley. He's an incredible dude. I owe him so much. And he is getting ready to launch his game, Art Club Challenge. Check it out. It's on iOS. I think largely meant for iPad. It's really, really cool. I rarely am able to find, educational games made by indies that really are focused on fostering creativity without really worrying about monetizing. And I love Jared for doing this.
Awesome.
And the other game is one of my favorite games from some of the cool people that I met at GDC last year. And I am going to GDC this year in 2018. If you want to track me down, just send me a message. Feel free to throw my Twitter handle in the comments or the description.
It'll absolutely be there, yeah.
It's called Gendirect, and it's by a couple of developers I know. I hope I'm pronouncing this properly. Let me double check here. Gendirect by Heather Robertson and Ryan Rose Asai, I think it is. And it's a really cool visual novel that deals a lot with topics and anxieties that transgender people go through. Some of my closest transgender friends really, really loved it. And the art and the style is really, really kind of prickly and spiky and great, and the writing is fantastic. It's really, really human, really, really raw, but also, from what I can see, really, really uplifting. And they're just a couple of great devs that I got to see out in San Francisco, and I really just want to get the word out there about their game. I've watched them both struggle through the development process and get it out, and the reception's been really warm, and I just want to kind of keep the ball rolling for them.
Fantastic. Well, Max, thank you for taking some time to talk to us about CrossNIQ and about the design process behind it. CrossNIQ will be coming to Kickstarter on February 5th, so keep an eye on the details below in this video for a link to that if you're looking for probably a demo or a place to try this out, see what kind of rewards there might be. Best of luck on the Kickstarter, and thanks again for taking the time to talk with us.
No problem. My pleasure.
Welcome to CrossNIQ.